My name is Karen Redrobe, and I'm the director of Penn's Wolf Humanities Center, and I'm very excited to welcome you here tonight for our lecture by Professor Dorothee Brantz, who will be introduced by Ramya shortly. This lecture is co-sponsored tonight by Penn's Department of Germanic Languages and Literature and the Penn Program in Environmental Humanities, and I want to thank them very much for their collaboration on the event. The Wolf Humanities Center program is generously sponsored by the Wolf Family Foundation, the Hershey Family Foundation, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, and the Office of the Dean in the School of Arts and Sciences. I want to thank all of our sponsors and also express my gratitude to our wonderful staff members, Sarah Varney, Sarah Malinsky, Drew Baker, and Raquel Fleskes. This year, as last, almost all of our events will have American Sign Language interpretation, and I want to thank the interpreters, Dr. Jamie Fisher and the American Sign Language Program, the Provost's Excellence Through Diversity Fund, the Penn Language Center, and the Office of the Dean in the School of Arts and Sciences. I also want to apologize to the members of our deaf community who attended the opening event, which was a lecture by Jason De Leon. It was advertised as an accessible event, but I have learned that the film that followed the lecture did not have captioning, so people were excluded from that who needed captions. I'm very sorry. And we're going to look into that for the future and make sure that confusion doesn't happen again. So please accept my apologies. We're going to have a Q&A after the talk, and as we record all of our events to make them accessible for a wider audience, we do ask that you raise your hand if you want to ask a question, and we'll bring a microphone to you, and that way it will come out on the recording. Our interpreters can also translate any questions that you might have into American Sign Language, so please just feel free to raise your hand. Our mission here is to open a fruitful space of exchange between the University of Pennsylvania and the people of the city of Philadelphia as one way of finding new modes of kinship. So we do ask that you take our program and share it with someone who you think might be interested in coming to these events who wouldn't come on their own. We have film screenings and all kinds of other conversations and lectures. Our next Wolf lecture will be on October 30th here in the Rainey Auditorium at 5 p.m., and it will be given by Professor Debelina Roy. She's an associate professor of women's, gender and sexuality studies and neuroscience and behavioral biology at Emory University. Her talk will be entitled Molecular Feminisms and Biophilosophies of Becoming. What does that mean, you might wonder? What I can tell you about this is that the questions that provoke Dr. Roy's research include, should feminists clone? Obviously. What do neurons think about? And what can we learn from bacterial writing? I can't imagine that you would not want to know the answers to these questions, so I look forward to seeing you next week. And now I'll turn the mic over to Ramya.
Before joining the Berlin Technical University as director of its Center for Metropolitan Studies in 2007, she taught at the university at Buffalo State University of New York. She holds a PhD in modern European history from the University of Chicago, writing her dissertation on slaughter in the city, the establishment of public abattoirs in Paris and Berlin between 1780 and 1914, for which she received the Richard Saller Dissertation Prize for the best dissertation in the social sciences. Her publications include A Cultural History of Animals in the Age of Empire, Thick Spaces, Approaches to Metropolitanism, Greening the City, Urban Landscapes in the 20th Century, and Beastly Natures, Animals, Humans, and the Study of History. She's currently working on 2 new projects. The first is about the impact of seasons on urban life in the US and Europe between 1900 and 2000. The other project asks about the role of nature in the transition from war to peace in 20th century Berlin. As an urban environmental historian who doesn't conceive of cities as simply human-made spaces, she's interested in the ways natural forces continue to shape urban developments. She's also curious about questions of temporality and how they manifest themselves in urban practices. And as a historian of warfare and as a citizen of the contemporary world, she also mulls over the meaning of peace, a concept that she finds to be hard to grasp. In her talk today, titled Kinship Reloaded, she asks, do we need a new notion of kinship to build more livable cities? A number of key thinkers have raised the question of kinship in the context of human-animal relations. But what specifically does that mean for the way we live in cities? In presenting historical and contemporary perspectives on human-animal interdependencies, she offers us a provocative vision for our urban future. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Karen Ridrope and to Ramya for inviting me, to Sarah Malinsky and Sarah Varney and Drew Baker for actually getting me here, and to all of you for showing up today. So I'm very grateful to Ramya for giving me the opportunity to think about kinship, a topic that has not really been at the center of my research interests thus far. Like most of us, I read Radcliffe Brown, I read Malinowski, I also read Claude Lévi-Strauss, but that's about it. So in that sense, I was very happy that in preparation for this talk, I actually got to think about notions of kinship and reevaluate what I actually think, we as humans, how we relate to other creatures and what the notion of kinship might have to do with that. And I'm also grateful because this gives me, or us, an opportunity to see each other again, Ramya. So, because she was a good friend and dear colleague at the University at Buffalo, where we were both assistant professors more than a decade ago. So, and we haven't really been able to catch up since. So it's great to see you, and I'm very happy to be here. So let's think about kinship. Animals, people, and the urban. If you are, and I must say too, should you get really bored doing this talk, there is a little game built into this. So look at the pictures very carefully because a number of them will repeat themselves. And maybe at the end, then you can tell me how many of them were shown more than once. So this, for those of you who are maybe more into images than words. Okay, but let's begin with the following question. Do we need a new notion of kinship to build more livable and sustainable cities? As Ramya just said, a number of key thinkers have raised the question of kinship in the context of human-animal relations, but what specifically does that mean for the way we live in cities? And I actually purposefully picked one on Philadelphia. And this is actually taken from the City magazine. So this is an image because they did a special issue on wild animals in the city. So you might check that out. This talk will offer some historical and contemporary perspectives on human-animal interdependencies to provide a, hopefully, thought-provoking vision of our urban future. I will start with a few remarks about the complex and contradictory history of human-animal relations in the Western world during the modern period. I will continue with some remarks about kinship, of course, since after all, that's why we're here, and also about the notion of a multi-species society. And I will end with some comments about what that might mean for our thinking about urban life. So let's look into the past, see where we are now, and what we might want for the future. Empirically, I will focus particularly on Berlin, which is my home city, and also the main focus on my academic research. But I will be more than happy during the Q&A then to also look into other cities, particularly talk maybe about Philadelphia, and to look at other urban perspectives that you might want to look at. But Berlin is going to be my focus. And I should actually say that most of the images I'm going to show, they are taken by Florian Möllers, a very acclaimed nature and animal photographer who has traveled all over the world to take pictures of wild animals. But according to him, he's never come as close to as many different wild animals as he has in the city of Berlin. So most, not all of the images are going to be taken by him. But let's start with two imaginary scenarios. Imagine a historical view from the future, the year 2090. Writing at the end of the 21st century, a young historian is looking back at the early decades of the century. She wants to write her dissertation about the environmental conditions of cities at the beginning of the 21st century and how they have contributed to cities she knows from her own life experience in the 2080s and 2090s. In her own time, cities are super smart, digitized to the T, streamlined and clean. They appear very civilized, even if they're not really, due to the continued inequalities inherent in the operation of this kind of urban systematicity. And these cities are quiet. The only sounds heard is the constant humming of machines, the quiet flow of traffic, or the low-voiced conversation of people constantly plugged in with others. There's no one barking, no birds twittering, and no other animal sounds, except for the voice recordings of chirping birds in subway stations that are supposed to calm people down, as seen in the Tokyo subway, and as I just discovered yesterday, also in the Amsterdam airport. So this is something we already have. There are also no smells of animals. And on a side note, I mean, you might want to think about what kinds of smells do you associate, with animals do you associate with the cities? Because there are very few smells of animals in our contemporary cities today. Can you think of any? 19th century was still full of them. Horses and horse manure, livestock, slaughterhouses, zoos, fish markets, or even just backyard gardens full of household animals. But back to our imaginary doctoral student in the 2090s. In her urban life world, there are no piles of dog poop in the streets, no trash cans that were picked through by wild animals during the night, no mosquitoes, no wasps, no squirrels trying to steal food, no rats roaming the underworld. Cities are humanized spaces. To be sure, they're green, they're trees, beautiful flower beds, and plenty of parks, many of them indoors. The plants are well groomed, they're resilient to the new climatic conditions. Many of them were brought from other regions of the world. They thrive in the urban heat islands, but they no longer offer a habitat to local insects and birds, bugs, or other critters. But they're green and luscious because they receive just the right amounts of water, light, and fertilizer, all provided through the exactly calculated and controlled technological means of artificial supply. It's quite pleasant and very smart, and it's a very smart world to live in. Not much is left to surprise. And hearing this, perhaps some of you might already think of some, cities that we know today. This is an image of the new terminal at the Singapore airport, where they actually turned, sort of the outside world into an inside space for relaxation, which I think is great. I mean, if you have to wait in an airport, I'd rather wait in this than wait in the food courts that we have in many other airports. Or you might also think of cities like Dubai. This is a view from the Burj Khalifa going down. Or even think of the new Sky Garden in London. And if you don't know where it is, it's on top of this building, the walkie-talkie building. So now let's shift to the second scenario. In a very different part of the world, another graduate student is interested in a very similar topic. He too wants to understand why cities became what they are, but his life world is rather different. It's also a big city, and it's also quite green. There are lots of plants everywhere, in the streets, on the plazas, on many facades of the buildings. There are parts of town that look like a veritable urban jungle. During the summer, one can swim in the river. During winters, people sled or skate on the ice. When it's hot, it is the coolest part of the city, and it's also quite noisy. There are birds, butterflies, and other insects. Sometimes people get stung. One needs to be careful with all of the small and larger creatures around. But the people who live here enjoy being part of an extended community of life. Milk and butter are produced locally because there is even some livestock around. But this is not like the countryside. This is the city, dense, diverse, and full of life. People, plants, and animals form a biotope city. There are gardens on the rooftops and also along the streets. People are busy with the upkeep of this urban environment, but it gives them a chance to participate. Many decisions are made locally, but they keep the global in mind. This city is not an enclave, but part of a different vision of life and kinship. This city is not terribly smart, but even though it also incorporates new technologies. People are mobile, but without cars. Technology is an aid in life, but it does not dictate what people are supposed to do. To use Richard Sennett's words, this city is kind of dumb, because nothing is optimized and people have to find their own way. They have to be mindful in their daily actions, and because of it, as Sennett says, there's room for the imagination and for human inspiration. The city does not look squeaky clean. There's smells, good and bad. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Of course, both of these scenarios are quite sketchy in every sense of the word, but they point us to an important question. As we sit here in 2019, with all the knowledge we have and all of the opportunities and challenges that lay clearly ahead of us, what kinds of urban environments we are striving towards? What kinds of cities do we want? And given our current actions and attitudes, what kind of cities will we have? Particularly with regard to animals, will they be a continued and self-guided presence in our urban future? Or will they only appear in environments controlled by us? Zoos, circuses, aquariums, terrariums, or dead on our plates, or in our fashion? It's a choice we have to make, and it's a choice that has a long history. Looking at the past, we know that many animals have disappeared from cities. For centuries, horses were the principal means of urban transport, for passengers, for goods, and building materials. Today, they are sometimes used as tourist attractions or by the police. And just to give you an example, this is Alexanderplatz and Potsdamer Platz. Alexanderplatz around 1900, Potsdamer Platz I think around 1920s. And you can see, first of all the bustle, but then also you can see, many different types of vehicles still motorized by horses. Nowadays, when we think about horses in the city, it's mainly tourist carriages, which are actually very controversial in Berlin. They were outlawed in 2018, but then there was another lawsuit, now they're allowed again. So it kind of goes back and forth. But and the reasons why people complain, because there's horse manure in the streets, they smell, exactly the things that I just mentioned. People also say, this is not safe for car travel. Others say this is not, good treatment for the horses. So there are lots of different opinions, but that's about it. And the other one, this is actually an image from Hamburg, is that the police is still using horses, sometimes particularly during demonstrations. But that too is very controversial, and the horse fleet in Hamburg has actually also been terminated. There were also livestock in 19th century cities. Pigs, chickens, milk cows, rabbits, and millions of animals who arrived in cities for the slaughterhouses. But animals destined to become food were increasingly taken out of sight in the growing metropoles of the 19th century. And as Ramya mentioned, I have argued elsewhere that this removal of livestock from public view and the emergence of modern centralized slaughterhouses was a key characteristic of 19th century European and North American urbanization. But as some animals disappeared from the city, others arrived. In the 19th century, pets, zoo animals, and also a growing number of unintended invasive species were brought to the city, at once attesting to a new sensibility towards some animals, and also to the rapid expansion of global networks and means of exchange. Even in our present-day cities, the number of animals far exceeds the number of humans who live in cities in most parts across the world. Pets, birds, rats, vermin, insects, fish. We'll get back to that. The species diversity in cities is often greater than in the surrounding countryside due to the monoculture and also to the planting patterns that you see, cutting down hedges and all sorts of things. Cities offer ample opportunities for housing, food, but most importantly, they have few natural enemies. So many animals, just as people, have adapted to urban life. And you can see this is actually a children's book, quite wonderful to have. I looked if there was Philadelphia in there. It's not in there, but I'm sure there's also some sort of iconic animal, iconic wild animal that's maybe associated with Philadelphia. And as you see, I think with the squirrel, it says, "I love living everywhere." So there is, I think it's in there somewhere. You might find it. Okay. So they love living in the city just as much as we do. And after all, we as humans are animals too. So let's take a closer look at the notion of kinship. Classical notions of kinship sought to explain the ties among humans and humans alone. Kinship was conceptualized as a distinct marker of human society and human culture. A sense of kinship, including all of the conflicts that it brings with it, is what sets us apart from animals. So much for the underlying assumption. The animal behaviorists Frans de Waal and Jane Goodall, among others, have long insisted that many animals, particularly chimps, have an elaborate social life that requires the establishment and constant negotiation and renegotiation of status hierarchies and social belonging in a complex web of social relations. Biological notions of kinship and family certainly play a role, even if they're not articulated as such. Pushing this notion of kinship further, Donna Haraway proclaimed, and I quote, "I think that the stretch and recomposition of kin are allowed by the fact that all earthlings are kin in the deepest sense, and it is past time to practice better care of kinds as assemblages, not species one at a time. Kin is an assembling sort of word. All critters share a common flesh, laterally, semiotically, and genealogically. Ancestors turn out to be very interesting strangers. Kin are unfamiliar, outside what we thought was family and gens. Uncanny, haunting, active." Scholars of kinship ever since the 1960s have insisted that kinship should not be limited to biological or genetic ties, but that kinship bonds can reach far beyond to a much broader sense of family and kin driven by affect rather than blood. Operating with such an extended concept of kinship in relation to animals, one might immediately think of pets. After all, they are considered part of the family. Here one is reminded of Donna Haraway's Companion Species Manifesto. And I saw that you have a film about Donna Haraway on the program later this semester, or this year. But what if we wanted to extend this notion even further? Can we feel kinship with fish? According to critical theory, particularly its key proponents, Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer, the domination of nature and men was one of the principal consequences of the dialectic of enlightenment. The advance of the sciences, technology, and reason were, for the most part, driven by an ideology of domination used to legitimate all sorts of subjugations. We probably all know René Descartes' famous claim that animals were unable to speak or reason and therefore could feel no pain, hence they were more akin to clocks than humans. In many ways, this line of reasoning seems to have guided our sense of animals, at least if we consider how we have treated them. But it would of course be too simple to leave it at that, and it would also be untrue. the debate was always much more complex and also much more controversial, of course. After all, modernity is full of complexities and contradictions. In contrast to Descartes, the English philosopher Jeremy Bentham, quite a century later, argued that the question about animals should not be, can they reason or do they have language, but can they feel pain? Simply put, these two positions mirror the opposing poles around which the debate about the treatment of animals has oscillated ever since. Today, few would dispute that animals can feel pain, even though we still treat them, many of them, as if they can't. In Germany, there's a debate right now, for instance, about cutting the tails of piglets without anesthetizing them before, and they know this is painful, but they do it anyway, out for business reasons, and they try to outlaw it, but this will take, a number of years. So this is a practice, that is being tolerated, legally tolerated, despite, the knowledge what this is actually doing to these animals. So in that sense, that kind of depicts this contradictory understanding. If modernity is premised on deep-seated contradictions, our relations to animals are a powerful way to make these contradictions visible. On the one hand, animals are considered as radically distinct from humans, which makes it possible to eat them, experiment on them, and to wear their furs. On the other hand, however, it is claimed that they are closely akin to us. For instance, when it comes to the justification for experiments for medical reasons or possible organ transplants, because that is done with the claim, that they are genetically very much like us. Moreover, there's also been a long dispute about different kinds of animals. Pigs can be eaten and poorly housed. Experiments on dogs were widely practiced in the 19th century, even though it was also staunchly criticized. But dogs were also increasingly fashionable as often bourgeois pets. In Western society, it is not acceptable to eat them. But in some cultures, dogs can be eaten. But pigs, on the other hand, are considered unfit to consume. Hence, any kind of animal kinship is historically specific and culturally conditioned. And now, what does that mean with regard to cities? And also, I very much like, this cartoon because it looks on. This is an image over there on Claude Bernard, a very famous vivisectionist of the 19th century, but also, acclaimed medical doctor. And this I liked because it kind of turns the notion, of zoos on its head in a number of different ways. But what does that mean for the city? In a positive sense, cities are viewed as spaces of opportunity, freedom, and experimentation. If that's really so, I guess we can debate that and think about our own life experiences. Many animals today seem to buy into this argument as well. As I stated above, it is not just human society that is urbanizing. The animal kingdom is becoming more urban as well. Some are driven to urbanize because humans are increasingly infringing on their habitats. Others are leaving the monoculture of the countryside behind for the plentiful resources of the city. According to an official Berlin statistic, Berlin houses more than 20,000 different animal and plant species. The German Nature Protection Society, NABU, estimates that more than 2/3 of all breeding bird species in Germany can be found in Berlin, which is quite astounding if you think about it. So who are some of these 20,000 species? So let's just look at some of them. I picked just a couple of examples. So this I picked for Etienne, actually. So if you want to read a really good essay on urban squirrels, read Etienne Benson's essay on it. So then there's, of course, pigeons and lots of crows that we have in cities. They're also, particularly in Berlin, There are tons of bunnies, and they actually, I don't know, some of you might know this, as Berlin, when it was still a divided city, they lived very well between the two different walls because they had no natural enemies there. They were too light to set off the mines. And so when the wall came down, thousands and thousands of rabbits were sort of released into the city. And so for them, actually, it turned out the coming down of the wall was quite a disaster. Because suddenly they found themselves in the middle of traffic, in the middle of city life. They were being hunted, they were being poisoned. And they're still living quite happily around the new sort of governmental quarters. You can find lots of them there. But in lots of other parts of the city where the former wall was, because there's also so much building going on, they have unfortunately disappeared. So this is actually a new inhabitant that has come from North America. So this is kind of a different kind of migration going from North America to Europe. And they have a bit of a weird story because they were actually, I think during the Nazi period, taken to Brandenburg to breed for fur. And then some of them, they escaped. So and ever since, they have been procreating and finding good places in the city. If you can see, one of them is like about to fall into the trash can. So foxes. Foxes is, of course, you have foxes here in Philadelphia as well. Because in Berlin, we now have them. There's a fox living near the TV tower. I mean, they're all over the city. They're learning how to deal with traffic. I, not too long ago, saw a fox right in front of my university building, which is a 5-lane street, with very heavy traffic, and a fox was walking towards the street, and a whole bunch of us were looking, and we were like, I hope we don't see the end of this critter about to get run over. And there was a bus coming, and he actually went back. He went back to the hedge he could come from, and probably thought, I'll try again later on. And that's actually the biggest sort of enemy for a lot of these larger creatures is traffic. So then there are falcons who are living in the city, having also very important jobs to do, taking care of rats, sick birds, all sorts of things, and creating sort of an ecosystem. Then there are these critters, of course, lots of them, and all kinds of estimations, how many rats there are per person. Our conservative estimates are 1. There's 1 rat for each of us. And more sort of ambitious estimates say there might be 4 or 5 for each of us. So that's definitely a large population. Berlin also very fond among boar who like to go, all the way close to houses. And this is another interesting newcomer to the city. This is actually an American river crab that has come. They don't know where it's come from. They don't know if people have brought it and then sort of put it into the Tiergarten, the main park in the center of the city. But they're procreating so much that they can be hunted now or fished out, to be eaten. And last year they took out 20,000 of them. People, that's what they counted, and this year they're all back. So this is definitely, a new American city dweller who really likes the city of Berlin. So birds of all kinds, of course, dogs. So this actually happens to be my own dog. So cats, and here you might look. Do you see the animal in here? A panda. So because the reason why I included this, and I included purposefully the image that makes it kind of hard to see the panda, is I wanted to have the wild animals, the domesticated animals, but also the zoo animals, because of course there are also thousands of them. Berlin is a city with a zoological garden, in size not as big, but it has sort of greatest species diversity among zoos, pretty much across the world. And they brought a pair of pandas from China 2 years ago. And this was a huge sort of political thing, a chancellor had to go to China, and there's all kinds of, who knows, backroom trading going on that the pandas could come. They are on Lent, so they have to go, back. And this is, in Germany, we sort of talk about this as panda diplomacy. There's all kinds. I had to go on TV to do interviews when the pandas came. This was a huge deal. So as you can see, they made a building just for them. And the reason I included this is to show, yes, they are animals, but they are very much sort of representative of something else, right? Maybe unlike, some of the others that I showed you. And I'm sure each of you could name numerous other animals that are missing here, or even some that are distinct to Philadelphia. I mean, can you name some that are distinct to Philadelphia? Possums? Yes, absolutely. Yeah, those we don't have in Germany. Oh.
The koi dog people are talking about, but I'm not sure.
Okay.
Supposedly there's a mix now.
Yeah. Okay, so yeah, because coyotes is also something that in American cities, particularly like in Los Angeles and cities in the Southwest, where coyotes also very much like to live. But what are we to do with this diversity? All of these animals are looking for food, places to live, raise their young, play, or just be. How can a city be a good habitat for them and for all of us? In that sense, we might need to rethink the urban as a multi-species society. Traditionally, cities were built for humans, and at least that's what the field of urban studies suggests. In contrast to the rule, the urban was depicted as the human realm of cultural production, political representation, technological innovation, and economic ambition. Architecture, planning, and the institutionalization of society were key areas of study. Mobility, social differentiation, and strife were other fields of interest. What was usually ignored, however, was that much of this production depended on the contribution of animals who transported goods, supplied their labor power, or their bodies for raw materials. In recent years, a growing number of scholars, myself included, are turning their attention to this urban co-production. And not just that. Scholars are reevaluating the urban and how it has served as living space for humans and animals. In recent years, a new idea has entered the discourse, the idea of a multi-species society, a term used by scholars like Donna Haraway, Anna Singh, Tom van Doren, Eben Kirksey, to name just a few. Decades ago, Claude Lévi-Strauss had identified kinship as a shared space. Scholars working with the concept of the multi-species society start from a similar premise. They maintain that humans exist in networks. Challenging the traditional humanist epistemology, they reject the ontological distinctions between nature and culture, as well as subject and object, in favor of a more inclusive relational perspective that seeks to overcome anthropocentrism. Interestingly, the academic discipline that has pursued this line of argument the most is anthropology. So here we are back, I guess, also with the study of kinship. Multi-species ethnography has emerged as a new subfield in anthropology and also as an interdisciplinary link to other related fields of study. Some already speak of a multi-species turn in anthropology. Empirically delineating this multi-speciesism and its impact in an urban context is a challenging task. A quick example for such a multi-species society in operation might be the airport. Granted, it's a little bit a tooth and claw kind of example, but it illustrates how creatures work together. Most airports, as we know, employ a number of animals. We have probably all seen the sniffing dogs who search for drugs or agricultural goods, but also outside on the airfield, there are usually a number of animals at work. For example, this little fellow. Ferrets are used to search out rabbits in the airfields. Getting rid of rabbits is important because they attract birds of prey, which in turn pose risks to planes taking off and landing. At airports, falcons are also used to chase away other flocks of birds. Using these animals as natural deterrents works much better than using guns or poison or whatever other technologies humans could use. Perhaps this is not a good example for collaboration, But it shows how it is possible for humans and animals to work together to assure urban flows. So, do we need a new notion of kinship to build more livable cities? In her introduction to this year's Wolf Center theme, Ramya wrote that kinship describes an emotional as much as, or perhaps even more than, a social community. Do animals belong to this emotional community? Could they even become a recognized part of our urban social community? Maybe we'll go back here. I don't mean that in terms of acknowledging their circumstantial presence, but valuing them as genuine participants of daily urban life in a multi-species society. And by circumstantial presence, I mean, just like rats, they just happen to be there, right? Nobody sort of brought them here, invited them, but they're here, and they will stay. So in that sense, how can we create a society where, all of them have, the possibility to be the ones we like as much as the ones we don't like? And this is not to say that animals are always wonderful, that their way of sharing urban space is unproblematic or easy. Donna Haraway argues that kin is a wild, and I quote again, kin is a wild category that all sorts of people do their best to domesticate. This domestication is making kin as odd kin rather than, or at least in addition to, godkin and genealogical and biogenetic family troubles. Important matters like to whom one is actually responsible. End of quote. She pleads for staying with the trouble, as she says, because that acknowledges the unexpected and the lively, as she calls it, collaborations and combinations. She also voiced the hope that this will counteract current trends toward the overemphasis of techno-fixes and apocalyptic thinking. Picking up on this current emphasis on crisis, Bruno Latour, who many years ago taught us that we've actually never been modern, recently proclaimed that we should stop talking about a supposed crisis. Our current world is not in crisis. It's not in a crisis from which it will recover. It is in a state of transformational, permanent alteration. So he actually says this is much more serious. Shifting our attention away from crisis towards transformation opens up new venues for change. Rather than looking for the quick fixes that a crisis mandates to overcome it, because crisis always has this notion that it can be overcome sooner or later. Transformation, not really. It's not a matter of overcoming, right? It's a matter of adapting to new circumstances. So rather than looking for quick fixes that the crisis mandates, the notion of transformation might enable us to have a more fundamental rethinking. For instance, it might offer an opportunity to reconsider long-held beliefs about the urban, to reconsider the complex urban relationships between humans and animals, and perhaps even the notion of kinship. That brings us back to the two scenarios that we had at the beginning of this talk. Given our current state of affairs, what kind of cities are we striving towards? So in closing, I would like to make 4 suggestions. First is, let cities be. Let's, in some ways, slow down and let things develop. And speaking, from the perspective of Berlin, where right now lots of things are being built up, and sort of former empty spaces, new buildings are put up. Sometimes, ecological sort of biotopes have grown up in central areas of the city. They're now torn down to put up housing that then is called the new Garden City housing. And whereas I think, yes, we do need new housing, but there needs to be maybe a more cautious approach to who is sponsoring this and who we're giving the city to, and who has the power to argue what city development should be like. And so in that sense, slow down and let things develop a little bit more, and maybe also leave things alone. To give you an example, recently in my neighborhood, a park was redone. I mean, it was already a park before. It was redone. 380,000 euros were spent to pave the pathways, to cut down a lot of trees, to put some benches there, to sort of add some sports equipment, and it actually looks quite nice. That's for sure, but there are also a lot of voices who say, why didn't they leave the park just the way it was? Because now there's a lot of pavement in there, where before they were just pathways where there were like bees living in the ground and all sorts of things, so they ruined all kinds of habitats. And they cut down a whole bunch of trees, and they could have just done sort of a much less invasive and much cheaper way to sort of recreate this urban space, and maybe taking some of the money to invest it rather in the maintenance of it, because now the park is there, but there's no money for maintaining it. So it will be interesting to see what it will look like within a couple of years. And there's there was a new wall put in to kind of keep away a little bit the noise from the street. And this being Berlin, this park has been open for about a week. There's already graffiti all over that wall, and it's called the Wall of Horror. Because it kind of creates this, sort of very strong distinction between what is the sidewalk and what is the park. And whereas before it was much more, sort of a gradual transition. And so there were lots of, good intentions, but, a lot of people are also saying, well, this could have just been left to itself. The same with tree trunks. Lots of trees are being cut down, but maybe in some ways just leave tree trunks lying where they are, if they're not in the middle of the street, of course. Because they have actually done studies in Berlin where they've looked at trees, how many animals live there. And they found in tree trunks up to 1,000 animals are living in just one trunk. And particularly in those, that have, fallen over and are no longer a tree in that sense. So that would be the first one, let cities be. The second point, plan and design more inclusively. And this is something, for, I guess, the experts who are dealing with urban design, planning, architecture, to maybe not just think green, because this is increasingly being done, not just to think green, but to think ecologically, to think about plants and animals. To give an example, not just to green facades, but to make them ecologically sound. Because it's good to plant, all kinds of things on facade, but I don't know, the things that, for instance, a Patrick Blanc will do, it's aesthetically maybe very beautiful, but ecologically, it's quite useless. But one could easily take, choose covers that also then could could serve as a refuge for birds, insects, and all kinds of creatures. And also, when we plan cities, think about creating green corridors rather than, sort of isolated urban parks to enable animal mobility across the city and into and back and forth to the countryside. And it sounds all very obvious. I mean, in a way, it sounds like, well, why aren't we doing that already? And that is precisely the question. Why aren't we doing that already? Because it reduces the heat island. It doesn't just work for the animals. It doesn't just work for the plants. It also works, in favor for us. But it's not being done. And there are all sorts of reasons. We just did a conference last week in Berlin on the biotope city, on greening and what can be done and how can we also deal with water, and all kinds of other, sort of means to create new cities. And we actually had to recognize that the same kind of debates were going on in the 1980s, and to some extent already around 1900. So we know all of this, but we're not doing it. So in that sense, it might sound obvious, but there is the question, why is it so difficult to do? Because it's not more expensive, so everybody's for it, but still it's not being done. So there must be a reason for it, and I don't have the answer why that is. The third one would be to practice participatory democracy. In that sense, to take a bottom-up approach to urban living. And this means also, to let people participate. This could be, a great exercise in urban citizenship, to bring children into urban citizenship, so to not limit citizenship to voting rights, but to also really have people participate. We have right now, strong debates about the right to the city, questions of who the city belongs to, and this could be a very good way to really give the city back to the people as well. Let people participate in creating more urban habitats. And this is happening all over, particularly in Berlin. There's a lot of that happening, people taking initiatives. But also about educating the public how to deal with animals. Don't feed wild animals. Birds in the winter, maybe, but don't throw, bread into lakes and, rivers and those sort of things. Don't flush food down the toilet. Water trees during the summer heat. And this is something, each and every one of us can do right in front of our buildings if we're lucky enough to have a tree. But a lot of people don't do that, right? And I hear this in Berlin. They say, well, the city should do that. The city cannot do that. The city cannot go around and water trees. But they are, in Germany, we had the second summer of a consecutive heat wave. People had to water the trees because otherwise they're dying. They will not, sort of maintain this. And trees are, of course, very important as habitats also for birds and all sorts of other animals. If you are interested in street trees and the role of street trees, Sonja Dümpelmann has written a wonderful book that just came out on street trees in Berlin and New York. So they can learn a lot more about it. And she's actually a new colleague of you here at the University of Pennsylvania. So the fourth point and the last point then is to develop a vision for the future. Because this is not just to say that we need to work very locally, but we also need to think globally. We need to act now, but we also need to think about the future. And how can we maybe be more appreciative and mindful of the world we have, rather than always striving towards something new? How can we have maybe the dumb city rather than the smart? And there's a lot of, potential for innovation right now, and there's a lot of talking about, digitizing cities, doing all sorts of other things. There's also lots going on, and I've just been here for a couple of hours, but looking around about, traffic concepts and recycling and all sorts of things. But to think about, sort of maybe the larger dimensions of it as well. And to also think about the urban in a larger context. It's not just about our cities. It's about our cities in global networks that include other cities elsewhere, that include the countryside, that include the electro trash heaps in African cities, that include the poisoned rivers in Asian cities where most of our clothing is produced. They just did an experiment in Berlin on Alexanderplatz in front of a big clothing store that produces very cheap fashion. They put an aquarium right in front of it. And they gave people poison, the kind of poison or the kind of stuff that's used to color clothing. And they took people who came out of the store, just bought lots of clothes for cheap. They were very happy. They made a good bargain. And they asked him, so would you, or no, actually they did it differently. They gave clothes away. They said, this is for free, you can take it. But what you have to do to get this shirt for free, you have to take this little bottle of poison and throw it into the aquarium. And there are fish throwing in there. And nobody would do it. But people are buying the clothes, right? And this is happening elsewhere. So this is exactly what I mean, that we need a vision that goes way beyond our cities. No one would poison maybe an aquarium, but are we, sort of implicitly aiding the poisoning of rivers and populations elsewhere? So in that sense, we need to think the urban in a larger context, but maybe also we need to develop a new notion of kinship. And with that, I thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to our discussion.
We're talking about changing the park around, and the consultants cut down many of the trees. I don't think they checked with the animals before they did that. So society is all working together, but the animals don't know they're part of our urban environment. They're just there. So you talk about bottom up, but I think you need some top-down thinking. What would the animals like to have happen to this park? Cut down the trees? I mean, overgrown is a word that we use. When any place is built up, it calls overgrown. Well, maybe somebody thinks it's overgrown, but I doubt if the animals think it's overgrown.
Well, I think that's precisely what I mean, because I wouldn't say, let's not do anything, let's leave everything to its own development, because that's not the answer either, right? Of course, trees need to be cut, maybe some trees need to be cut down, but we do need to be conscious how and when we do it. I see an increasing sort of argument that for safety reasons, trees can be cut down any time of year. Even though in Germany we have a law, you cannot cut down trees during breeding season between March and September. But if you have the argument that there might be a safety issue involved, you can cut it down anytime you want. And I think that's what I mean, is to be a little bit more mindful and not to just think about, well, this tree doesn't look good here, let's cut it down. To maybe think about, well, you know, what kinds of animals are living there? And not to say then, well, there are 3 animals living there, therefore it has to stay, but also not to say, you know, let's just cut it down, who cares, you know, what's there. I mean, to be mindful of it, right? So that's what I would say. And oftentimes, I think planning can be done, because what's oftentimes done, trees are cut down, buildings are put up, and then trees are planted again. So in some ways, you know, maybe trees can then also be moved, or, you know, different options, just to consider them at least. Right?
Hi, thank you for a really exciting talk. I had a question that's kind of, I guess, more about the politics of the kinship that you're proposing. I'm wondering, in terms of this more livable cities, the kinds of like hierarchies of living beings involved, and I just wonder if you could speak more to, like, when you showed us the image of the hawk, you mentioned how the hawk does many useful jobs. And I'm just wondering about the kind of neoliberal thinking that can sneak into the ways that we talk about animals. I appreciated that you didn't use the language of invasive species throughout, but that's kind of, I think, along the periphery of a lot of conversations around human-animal relations. And so I'm particularly curious about how concepts of multicultural toleration might be circulating or at risk of circulating within what I think you're proposing is a much more radical kind of politics than that. But I guess when we have these new creatures arriving from the countryside into the city, there's this sense of migration that's kind of at the periphery of that. But I wonder what happens to the migrants who are not good migrants, who don't assimilate in useful ways.
Mm-hmm. Can I just ask you, because you said, sort of the neoliberal tendencies in this, what do you mean by neoliberal in this context?
Oh, so I appreciate that you left invasive species to the side, because I find that that kind of binary distinction between the invasive species versus the appropriate species is often, so like, for example, plant species, the plants that invade, like in the North American prairies, wheat is an invasive species, but we don't talk about it that way because it's useful to us. Whereas Scotch broom, which can infiltrate and has no use, and use I mean in terms of like capitalism, is how I kind of see that working.
Yeah. I think it's a very good question, but it's a very difficult one, because with animals per se, it's hard to say, what is, I mean, some it's clear to say what's invasive, what's not, in a sort of bad way. For instance, there are certain bugs like Borkenkäfer who are not just in cities, but also in the woods, attacking lots of trees, and they're procreating very well, I mean, because they do very well in the heat. And they're creating big problems for trees. So there are definitely issues. I mean, there are also, being bugs and all kinds of things being brought into the city, as I said, sort of unintendedly through global exchange, where we don't know, because then they have no natural enemies, so they might procreate and, sort of wipe out other species. So there is definitely potential problems, but I think this is something that needs to be dealt with. That's why I kept saying too, this is not all pretty, right? This is not just, this is not like, in that sense, parks, right? Where everything is sort of manicured and controlled. And it's, even though, I mean, if a park is done right, it's also, it is created, but then it's also in many ways left to itself, right? Because some plants grow, others don't, right? So nothing is totally controlled by us, right? I mean, there might be lots of intentionality, but the same with animals, and I guess this is something that we need to see then how to deal with it, but the same there, it can't be just particularly not our aesthetic considerations that would then say this animal is okay or this one isn't. Like right now, foxes are still liked because they're staying away, they're cute, they don't have really, they don't have rabies these days, but what if they do? And what's gonna happen then? So, and I think that's just what it would need. If we have sort of more sense of kinship, then it's not as soon as there's the smallest kind of problem that emerges, then, we have this big discussion about wolves in Germany right now, right? I mean, the wolf is returning, and the first times wolves have taken sheep, there's large cries, all the wolves need to be shot, right? So, and there are, of course, different camps. But this, I think, is also where, there's a lot of need, for political negotiation. I mean, different opinions, let them be heard, right? So, because obviously there are also a lot of people, maybe they're not here. If you are one of them, it would be great to hear from you, who think there should be no animals in the city. Because there might also be good arguments to be made about that. The city is for humans. I mean, that's how it was created. That's how urban studies has dealt with it. Do we need animals in the city? I mean, the scenario I drew up in the beginning, one was exactly that, right? It was nice, it was green, it was clean. And many people would say that's exactly the kind of city we want, right? Yes.
Yeah, thank you for your wonderful talk. I wanted to ask you to say a little bit more about a question you left unanswered. And I have a personal interest in this, but can fish be kin? And if not, why not? What does the difficulty say? Perhaps a related question might be, can food be kin? And what are the consequences of thinking of food and kinship together?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because I actually wanted in my presentation, I wanted to include a picture of fish. And I put into the search engine fish in Berlin. And what came up is either people fishing and showing the pictures of the fish they caught, or plates of fish as food. And I could not find an image or dead fish. There were lots of dead fish too, because there's, seasonal, sort of dying as rivers get warmer, in the spring, a lot of fish die. So these are the three images that I had. And I thought none of them would really, sort of work for this mixed picture. So fish is a very interesting question. And I think it's also a question in human-animal studies, because fish, I mean, I don't know, Etienne, you might know more about this. Often, we have lots of study of rivers and water in environmental history. Fish is still not treated that much, even in human-animal studies. But it would be interesting. But I don't have an answer to a question that, can we have kinship with fish? Because I wouldn't, think I can maybe answer this for myself, but maybe not, for all of us, right? So.
Thanks so much for this presentation. Especially love the animal slide. Was really lovely to see the variety of wildlife in Berlin. I'm sort of stuck on, though, the repetition throughout the talk of the urban and what's kind of contained in that for you. And I started to kind of fill in that in my mind through in relationship to the topic of this. Of this talk, and really wonder, where is the place for thinking a little bit more about the urban as a machinery for, I think this is picking up the question over here, a machinery for sorting life that is livable or desirable, sorting between types of human life, human and others, whether it's even worth asking a question, do we want animals in the city, without asking ourselves, how do we, I don't know what the verb would be, program, pursue. I think it would have to start with, how do we even imagine a city in which, mass populations of humans and others aren't suffering conditions of enclosure, exclusion, deprivation, life not worth living. This is the discourse that I sort of craved a little bit in this talk, and I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that, and its links to The final way to kind of think about it too is these two fantasy visions that begin in the talk, of a city in which we live in this utopia of human and animal. That human-animal encounter or no animals whatsoever. Both seems like a little bit of a false choice, but also it's kind of beholden to the myth that we can rationalize our way to whichever outcome we want anyways, that we're not surrounded by these machineries of deprivation and exclusion and so apologize for going on a bit longer than I meant to, but I'm curious to kind of hear you respond to this question too, especially of what the urban is doing and operating and talk. Thanks.
Thank you for the question. I hope I didn't create this impression, that sort of it is all in our control to, create it one way or the other. Because I tried to emphasize over and over, there is a lot to be left to chance, and there's a lot we can't control, because precisely, when I said we should leave things alone, is we should get away from this ideology, that we can control and determine everything. Right? So, and there is a lot of injustice, inequality. That's what I also said, even in the, sort of brave new world that seemed very, sanitized, happy and clean for some, it isn't, for a lot of others who are required to do, the jobs that kind of make the city livable for some. Right? So, and I don't know with regard to, this is something, that would have to be negotiated, right? And I'm very cautious, to make this argument, this is what we say about human-animal relations, and this is what we say about human-human relations, right? Particularly when it comes to sort of notions of migration, inequality, people or animals coming to the city, because I think they're two different topics, and they need to be dealt with in distinct ways, right? So I think they shouldn't be conflated. And I'm not a scholar of migration, so in that sense, I always try to stay clear of any arguments that would sort of go in that direction. All I can say from my perspective, when I talked about sort of this notion of a more participatory democracy, that this is also something, and we do see this, right? We do see this in urban gardening projects. We have these sort of intercultural gardens, for instance, in Berlin, where it's purposefully tried to bring, different communities together, and also to really come together and discuss, which plants to grow, what the purpose is of doing it, how to do it, and to bring different people into the city. And also this is what I meant when I said to have citizenship, not just as a concept that's related to voting rights, right? Because voting rights is already very, sort of limited to certain parts of the population. It excludes anyone who doesn't have citizenship. It also includes, as I said, it excludes children, it excludes, lots of other people who would have an opportunity to participate in a city, though, maybe in other ways. I don't know if that satisfied what, you wanted to know. But, we can definitely discuss it, too, especially if you see it differently.
I'm going to start by saying I'm not a scholar at all, but I'm really glad to hear this conversation. I actually have a career creating habitats. In fact, my title is a habiteer. I create habitats. So I'm a practitioner in the field that you're researching and considering. And I don't have a useful framework for the work that I do now. I've spent much of my career creating nature centers and environmental education centers, and I'm now trying to take that outdoors. But we're in a museum here, right? This is a curated space. Our zoos are curated spaces. Our aquariums are curated spaces, and our cities are curated spaces. And almost exclusively in our cities, it's curated for bipedal hominids, for our species, right? And we curate it, and sometimes we're generous, we have empathy, we think about the animals, but we're really curating it for ourselves. So my question is really about your research, which is, are you seeing that there is scholarship or research happening now looking at the issue of who are we creating and curating the habitats for? You mentioned, like your multi-species. I think that's, I'm curious about that. You mentioned about Fairmont Park. We have 10,000 acres in Fairmont Park, one of the largest municipal parks, certainly in the country, if not the world. Until last year, with my partner Carol and myself, we created the first nature sanctuary in the 10,000 acres and a quarter of an acre that is just to protect the northern water snakes in the Wissahickon Park. So if you think about that, that's like 1/10,000th% of the entire Fairmont Park system that's curated for something other than humans, for the actual inhabitants there. So I'm kind of making a statement, but the statement is really a question about, are you seeing a reframing of who we're creating our urban environments for?
Yeah, thank you so much. And I think it's a very interesting way to put it, cities as curated. And because I think also linking back to the last question, right? Because you said, of course, cities are curated for humans, but then that would necessitate for who, right? For people in certain circumstances, with certain means, it's not created for all humans equally either, right? And I think that's the kind of question, that you were raising too. There is not the category human and there everybody's equal and then there's sort of the other, right? So to the extent that cities are curated, they're not even curated equally for, human inhabitants, right? So that as the first, recognition, right? And with regard to natural spaces, I do see that there's a reconsideration or new thinking about parks, and maybe that is a little bit distinct from many, sort of 19th, early 20th century vision, where it really was about humans creating parks for human recreation, for sports, for all sorts of things as part of the sort of hygiene movement. Whereas now it's much more an ecological understanding, and we do. If I can just speak for Berlin, we do have a couple of parks that were, sort of old industrial areas where plants had just grown and biotopes had developed and that were turned into parks now, but with a conscious effort, people can visit, but you have to walk on sort of wooden pathways to not disturb the biotope that's creating. So to make it kind of less invasive. And I do see more and more initiatives to actually be more conscious about that and to have a more sort of ecological understanding. And with regard to also the curated spaces, I was thinking, since you said museums, there are more and more efforts, if you think about citizen science, for instance, right, to take curation to a new level, right? To let people participate and to take in, people's observations, from their private gardens. When they're trying to figure out, when I said, they had 20,000 different plants and animal species in Berlin, large part of that knowledge accumulation depends on people actually going out in their backyards and counting what they see, sending in images. So, there's a lot of, I think, this kind of stuff happening. And it's also, museums are moving outside their walls, right? So I think there is a emerging understanding that kind of goes beyond, right? Also how we institutionalize cities and how we create certain spaces for certain things, right? So.
Dorothee, thank you for your great talk, and I feel like we should let you go in a moment, but I wanted to ask you a question that is prompted, I think, partly by you're talking about Berlin so much, but also seeing so many images made me think about the function of symbolic animals in cities' identities, whether it's Berlin as a city of bears or Bern, but also I was thinking about those sculptural projects where a city will decide to install cows everywhere and have them decorated in different ways, which my friend, the late Douglas Crimp, described as the project of keeping art meaningless. But what is the function of symbolic animals in defining urban spaces as you're thinking about these questions?
Right. It's something I've been, sort of over the years thinking about a lot, because it's also historically, I mean, in many ways, as animals disappeared, images kind of moved into the city more and more and more, right? I mean, if you think about when you go around, I mean, try to pay attention how many animals you see in pictures. I mean, be it advertisements, be it sculptures, be it all kinds of things. So our cities are full of, not just living creatures, but also representations of them. But what really their meaning is, I think in some ways, it's kind of going towards the absurd. For instance, when, images of pigs are used as advertising for pork, and you see the happy pig standing in front of the butcher shop, as sort of a billboard and, trying to get people to come inside. And the cows, I don't know if anyone has, sort of done a study to see, what the cow art, because I mean, this traveled everywhere, right? I mean, it was hugely successful. What effect it had, if people then, sort of thought about the products coming from cows in different ways. I mean, it's also, if you look at different cows, they did different things, right? Some of them had nothing to do, it was just the body of a cow for a completely different artwork. Some of them actually worked with the image of the cow and sort of really try to thematize, what is this and what is this absurdity in a way. Particularly, as the exhibition was in Chicago, the city that for, a long time was sort of home to, the biggest slaughterhouses in the world, and what is sort of the irony of all of this. And so I think it can serve different functions, but it's definitely curious how many of them there are. As we're saying, and I guess we've said it here in this room too, right? Cities are for people. So why even have, animal representations? Why have cows and bears and all those things? What is it? I mean, what is this fascination that we have, right? That most of the children's books are about animals. That, they're everywhere, right? But why? I mean, so.
Well, I think we're out of time, but I want to ask you to join me in thanking Dorothee Brantz for a wonderful talk.
Thank you.